Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson and I am an author. These are my two wonderful books right here. Neither of these are a sequel. So, I guess you can look at today's topic and angrily shake your fist at me and say, you ain't never published no sequel. But today, we're going to talk about sequels anyway, so deal with it. The Legend of Korra is the sequel series to Avatar: The Last Airbender, and for the most part, it's really good, I think. But one thing about it that I see a lot of people hate, and something I don't entirely disagree with, is how they didn't handle spirits all that well. The spirits in Avatar felt very natural, like they were a part of the world and had a role in it. But the spirits in Korra never really feel like this to me. They feel more like generic monsters you would see in a fantasy game. And the new lore introduced about spirits didn't really help with this. In Avatar, spirits seem to be like embodiments of the environment. Heibai was the spirit of the forest, Yue the spirit of the moon, Ko the spirit of a loss of identity. Korra feels like it turns around and says something more along the lines of, spirits are the animals of the spirit wilds. Sequels almost always introduce new aspects of the world that we never saw in the previous entries of the series. The example I just listed out with Korra, though, is an example how, when done improperly, it can almost feel like you're trotting on established lore you've already built, and that will almost always be received negatively. And sometimes you can just move past it. In The World Ends With You, for instance, the characters are caught up in this thing called the Reaper's Game, but from the first TWEWY game to the second, the rules of the Reaper's Game changed, and it was really off-putting at first. And while the rules in Nioh, the second game, fit the story of Nioh more, it still feels really off, especially if you play the two games back to back. So I wanted to take a look at a few franchises that handled things well and talk about how they did it. What made the new lore introduced work as opposed to times where it didn't. So the franchise that inspired me to make this video is the Ender Flower video games. There are two of them. There's Ender Lilies and Ender Magnolia. I will be dropping a few spoilers for both, so keep that in mind. In these two games, the big central threat to the world is something called the Rain of Death, which is, it's rain of death. And when people are struck with this rain, they're turned into something called a Blighted, which is basically just a zombie, but literally unkillable. The only way to get rid of a Blighted is for a priestess to cleanse the blight by taking it into herself. The problem is, the priestesses with this power to do so are incredibly rare because their bloodline has to descend from the now virtually extinct ancients. The two games take place in two neighboring kingdoms, and both kingdoms only have a single priestess who can do this. One way to easily introduce new pieces of lore is to set the sequel in a new location. In the Ender Flower games, the two games take place in neighboring kingdoms, but if you do this, it's important to have some sort of connecting thread between them. In the Ender Flower games, this connecting thread is the Rain of Death, and both games are kind of exploring how the two kingdoms deal with it. Both kingdoms wound up resorting to cloning the priestess, but in Lilies, the clones are used very straightforward. They essentially send these little girls out into the blight-ridden kingdom to go and purify the blighted directly. In the more technologically advanced Land of Fumes, however, they don't fully grow these priestesses, instead only growing them enough to fit within devices called purifiers, which are given to sorcerers who go around purifying the blighted. Both of these solutions are pretty horrible, but the solution in Land of Fumes is a lot more out of sight. When I first started in Magnolia, I was surprised how much more well-off the kingdom seemed to be, because these ugly truths were hidden away more completely, while in Lilies we see several of the dead priestess clones as we're exploring the kingdom. And this is only one example. There are a lot of similar cases of this, where we see how the advanced magic tech of the Land of Fumes resulted in them handling the Rain of Death in a much different way to the medieval Land's End. And it's really fascinating to see, it really makes you feel like this world is really well built. When faced with the same problem, two different kingdoms deal with it in two different ways, but they might come to some of the same solutions. It's really clever. But okay, what if your heroes went all over the world in the first book, and there's a pretty solid grasp on how the world as a whole already is? How can you keep your story in the same location, the same world, and still introduce this new lore in an effective way? Another solution is to look at a piece of your lore that felt like it could have been expanded upon, but wasn't. We're actually going to go back to The Legend of Korra for this, because while it made a blunder or two when it came to certain aspects of expanding its lore, one thing I thought was really clever was how the villain of Season 1 was trying to tackle an issue in the world that wasn't ever really touched on in Avatar, being the disparity between benders and non-benders. If you really stopped to think about the world of Avatar, you probably would have come to the conclusion that this was a problem in the world somewhere. People with power tend to enter positions of power. In the Water Tribe and Earth Kingdom, people with bending had more opportunities for work, being able to help with things like construction in a much easier way than someone who doesn't bend could. Not to mention, if physical forces ever needed to be applied, more often than not, you'd have a better chance at victory if your soldiers could bend. Avatar touched on this a little bit, but it mostly went under the radar. To me, though, the first season of The Legend of Korra feels like such a natural extension of Avatar's world, because this is an issue that just feels like it would naturally arise in the world sooner or later, and the advent of the advanced technology in Korra is the perfect catalyst for a non-bender equality movement. Now, yes, there is some stuff they could have done better with it, especially after Amon was defeated, but overall I felt like it was handled pretty well. And of course, Korra also sets its world in the future, which is another good way you can expand upon your world without feeling like you're trampling on what was already established. Especially if there was a big shakeup at the end of your story, setting the story in the future to see how those events impacted the world and how the world has changed since then is a great way to go about things. Like, if magic was once freely distributed to anyone, but at the end of your story the magic was destroyed, exploring how the world adapted to losing its magic is an easy plot thread for you to follow that your readers are no doubt already wondering about. But let's say you don't want to lose your established cast, so going to a different location or going to the future isn't an option. And let's say there are no real huge open plot threads you can find to expand upon. You want to actually just implement a new piece of lore to the story. There are two big factors you want to think about here. One, does this new piece of lore conflict with anything that's already established? And two, does this new piece of lore build on any of the previously established systems? It should go without saying, but you don't really want your lore to conflict with anything you've already said. In The World Ends With You, entry into the Reaper's game had a fee, and this fee was whatever you valued most. You'd get it back as long as you completed the game. In Neo, there were a lot of changes to the game, but this was the one that struck me as the most odd. There was no entry fee. And while I adjusted to this relatively quickly, and the game still conveys the information of what's most important to these characters in other ways, it still really put me off when I first started the story, and I could see someone who's a bit more impulsive dropping the story right then and there. On the other side of the spectrum though, going back to Ender Magnolia, the idea of still cloning the priestesses to take care of the blight, but keeping the clones in little capsules instead of letting a bunch of children run around and suffer for the fate of the kingdom feels like a very natural extension of things. A very awful natural extension of things, granted, but if the suffering of these children is seen as vital to the well-being of the kingdom, then finding a way to hide the suffering from the view of the general public is the natural first step for someone to take with no morals. It didn't occur to me until writing this script, but I'm getting BioShock Little Sister vibes here. Anyway, this idea though of making purifiers, these devices the priestess clones are crammed into, isn't something that necessarily has to come out of the world. It's a new piece of the lore that feels natural, but it's not something you go through the first game thinking, oh yeah, they really need to do something about this, because the system that Lanza had was actually working just fine. As morally reprehensible as it was, the White Priestesses are revered in the eyes of the public, and the only ones who see it as morally reprehensible are the ones who see the cloning process itself, and the ones who see the state of the priestesses after they've taken in too much blight. Or, in other words, what you want to do if you're just making an entirely new piece of lore is you want to somehow tie it to the old pieces without contradicting them. And if you don't want that connection, then it's best to set the sequel in a new location or in the future where those ties to the past are a lot less likely to happen. The other good method of introducing another piece of lore is to have it come from somewhere else, like an alien invasion, for instance, but this one runs the risk of feeling a little cheap if not handled properly. I tried to scour for an example of this one, but I couldn't really find one that was all that great. Dragon Ball Z was my first thought, where a lot of the villains come in despite us having never heard of them before. The Saiyans were just kind of random aliens who Goku was apparently one of, and then Frieza is apparently who the Saiyans work for, etc. But while I like a lot of the individual plot lines of Dragon Ball Z, the introduction to the new threats was never a part of it I was particularly fond of. Like, I loved the Majin Buu plot line, but the new villains kind of just come out of nowhere and it's not particularly satisfying. Still, it also wasn't particularly unsatisfying, so it might not be a bad idea if you want to just introduce something totally out there like a pink bubblegum demon. But that's all from me. You should go play Ender Lilies. It's great, and I'll see you in another video.